In the aftermath of the 7 Years' War, the American colonies had gone through profound change. The promise the British government had made the colonies of expanding living space fell through after the British government declared the Appalachian Proclamation that would prevent any settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains and left the land to the Native Americans. This angered the American colonists, who felt like they had sacrificed time, lives, and money and deserved new lands to settle upon. Beginning in 1763 with the passage of the Navigation Acts, the British Parliament began to pass laws that were meant to re-exert economic and political control over the American provinces. Up until the 7 Years' War, the American colonial governments had been able to act mostly independent and settle their own affairs without the watchful eye of the British government. After the British spent loads of money fighting in the Americas, they felt that it was fair that the colonists pay taxes to cover the war expenses that had been incurred fighting in their backyard. Following the Navigation Acts, the British passed the Sugar Act, Currency Act, and most famously, the Stamp Act, where the previous tax laws taxed currency, sugar, and trade. The Stamp Act made it possible to tax anything made of paper, and this tax had to be paid in British currency rather than in American colonial currency. This set of taxes passed between 1763 and 1765 angered the colonists. This is when the saying "no taxation without representation" became popular, given that the British were taxing the colonists without having any of their representatives in the British Parliament. These acts were repealed, but were replaced by the Townshend Acts. The Townshend Acts were taxes placed on pretty much any imported good into the American colonies. This once again inflamed tensions between the colonists and the British government. This was the status quo until two events really threw the American Revolution into gear. In 1770, a riot broke out in Boston between the British garrison and the colonists. In all the confusion, the garrison fired upon the colonists. In total, 5 died, including Crispus Attucks, a former slave. This event was also followed 3 years later, in 1773, by the Boston Tea Party. During this time, a group of American colonists by the name of the Sons of Liberty dressed up as natives and raided British merchant ships and dumped all their contents, mostly tea, into the Boston harbor. This event was made to show displeasure against the Tea Act, an act that, I bet you can guess based off of all the other acts, taxed tea. In response to all of this, the British government authorized the deployment of British forces to Boston to control the civil unrest. They also passed the Intolerable Acts, which were meant to punish the colonists who were rebelling and causing unrest in the British colonies. This backfired, though, because contrary to what they believed, this actually caused even more unrest. On April 14, 1775, General Thomas Gage dispatched Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith to march inland in order to confiscate weapons that the Patriots had stored at Concord and to arrest leaders of what he believed to be a rebellion. Upon hearing this, Paul Revere, a Patriot himself, undertook his famous ride into the countryside of Massachusetts, where he warned many of the smaller towns of the British. From there, other riders went off into the Massachusetts countryside, and slowly but surely the entire colony began to understand what was going on. The Minutemen began to form at Lexington and Concord and some of the other smaller towns. These militias were called Minutemen since they could be called up at a moment's notice, anywhere at any time. As the night went on and the British column moved inland, the Minutemen began to group up at Lexington. Captain John Parker stood in Lexington with his 40 Minutemen and waited for the British column. Parker famously said, "Stand your ground. Don't fire unless fired upon, but let it begin here if they mean to have a war." A British officer called for the militia to put down their arms, and Captain Parker even told his men to disperse. But Captain Parker was also suffering from tuberculosis, and as such his voice was distorted. Some militia didn't hear him, and instead held their ground. Both sides were in a stalemate. Both held their fire, but there was some unease. Suddenly, a shot rang out from somewhere in the town. This shot, whose origin is still to this day unknown, is now called the shot heard round the world. There was a moment of pause, and then both sides began engaging in sporadic firing. Eventually, the British fixed bayonets and charged. This dispersed the militia. In total, the British had 1 wounded and the Americans had 8 killed. The British column continued to march towards Concord. The Minutemen there had stationed themselves outside the town to gather strength and see what the British planned to do. When the British arrived in Concord, they burned some of the leftover food, 3 cannons, cannon cartridges, and some musket balls. Seeing this and the fact that the British only had light infantry there, the militia moved and approached the town. Over 400 Minutemen formed up against the 95 British soldiers in the town. Seeing this, the British removed themselves from the town and began to pull back across the river. There, a British private fired off what was meant to be a warning shot, but it ended up with 2 British regulars firing off shots that killed 2 American militiamen. Another few British shot and wounded 4 more Americans. The militiamen then fired a volley towards the British, which wounded 4 officers and 9 soldiers and killed 3 soldiers. After this, the British began the long march back to Boston. The entire time, militiamen would harass the British with volleys of musket fire. This guerrilla warfare took its toll, as militia would fire from the trees and hills and just fade away afterwards, leaving dead British soldiers. During this time, the militias from around the entire region began to show up and group up, and by the time the British Army had returned to the relative safety of Boston, 15,000 militiamen began to dig in and lay siege. What was supposed to have been a short, one-day incursion to seize some supplies and rebel leaders had, in about 24 hours, ballooned in scale. Upon hearing about the battles of Lexington and Concord, John Adams, the eventual second president of the United States, rode down to the battle lines. When he saw the true scale of what had occurred, he proclaimed, "This die is cast. The Rubicon is crossed." The American Revolution had begun. With the outbreak of war, militias from around the colonies began to form and attack British possessions in the South, North, and even Canada. We will get to these events later. For now, let's talk about the siege of Boston. The Boston militia forces made it impossible for the British to resupply their forces from foraging and prevented land reinforcements. At this point, British control only amounted to the city of Boston and some of the smaller surrounding suburbs. The Patriot militias occupied the hills on all sides of the city. If the British were going to get reinforcements, they would have to get them from the sea. The militia had settled in on April 19th. 16,000 Patriots surrounded the city. Supply for the British was not a problem, though. The colonists had little to no heavy artillery, so the Royal Navy could quickly resupply the garrison by sea. The British then dug in and were able to deploy their own heavy cannons to combat Patriot positions. Over the next month, things became monotonous. Here is a basic idea of what events would happen. The British would bring reinforcements by boat. The colonists would try to stop it, but they did not have enough heavy artillery, so nothing really happened. Then the British could not break out of Boston because there were still 16,000 militiamen, far too many to even try to attempt to break out. There was an exception to this, though. The British forces launched a raid to capture cattle and hay since they could not get any fresh beef and hay while in Boston. The colonists figured this out, though, and were able to fight off the raid before the British were able to get most of their goals accomplished. They only got a little bit of hay and a tiny bit of beef, but that's about it. As previously mentioned, there is one thing the British had that the colonists did not, and that was heavy guns. The British were able to fortify their parts of the city. Any attack by the Americans without any other kind of counter-battery fire would prove to be difficult at best and suicidal at worst. Understanding this predicament, the Massachusetts Provisional Congress asked a man by the name of Benedict Arnold to raise a small force and then march them off into New York to capture the British-held Fort Ticonderoga, since reports said it was lightly defended. He marched off in early May. On his way there, he ran into Ethan Allen, who had raised a small force of militia to also seize Fort Ticonderoga. The two decided, well, shoot, we're both going there, why not do it together? and marched off. They were able to easily capture Fort Ticonderoga and Fort Crown Point, and in total found themselves in the possession of 180 cannons, howitzers, and mortars, loads of ammunition, and just other munitions. The capture of these forts and their supplies would single-handedly supply most of the forces for the beginning of the war. Something occurred to them, though. Sure, they had all these cannons here in upstate New York at Fort Ticonderoga, but they actually needed to transport them back over to Boston. Getting them there would be much easier said than done. We will get back to this predicament in a little bit. By late May, 3 British generals had arrived in Boston. There were now 4 British generals, and eventually by early June, 6,000 British soldiers, and that number kept increasing daily. With his new reinforcements, General Gage began to draw up plans to expand his control. He originally drew up plans to capture Dorchester Heights and Charlestown, but then decided to attack Charlestown first, and then Dorchester Heights if the attack was successful. Getting these areas under their control would allow for the British to push back colonial lines and put artillery batteries on even more advantageous positions. On June 15th, American intelligence got word of the impending British attack on Charlestown. The following day, Colonel William Prescott took 1,200 men and fortified the area he awaited their assault. In the afternoon of June 17th, British forces began their attack on the dug-in Americans. The day before, the Americans had been able to reinforce with another 1,200 men, which now their total men on this peninsula was about 2,400. This meant that the British would be going up against a well-entrenched force with a good amount of reserves. As the British advanced towards the colonists, legend has it that Israel Putnam was said to have given the order to his men, "Men, you are all marksmen. Don't fire until you see the white of their eyes." This was said to have been meant for them to save gunpowder, but truthfully, I'm of the opinion that he just wanted to sound awesome. Anyways, the first British assault was met with furious resistance. The fortifications the colonists had set up included metal bars for their defenders to place their muskets on to make their accuracy better. This paid off in dividends. The British regulars were left out in the open, and while some were able to return fire, many were just cut down by gunfire. General Howe, seeing that this attack hadn't worked at all, called his men back. This time, instead of making any diversionary attacks, he would make it really, really simple. His men would assault the same positions and literally the exact same before. I know, simply brilliant. The second wave occurred much like the first. I could go into a lengthy description of what happened, but I believe this quote from a British soldier sums it up perfectly. Most of our grenadiers and light infantry, the moment of presenting themselves, lost 3/4, and many 9/10 of their men. Some had only 8 or 9 men in a company left. By this time, there was panic all across the battlefield. American soldiers were trying to desert, and British soldiers were trying to get all their dead and wounded back to their ships. General Howe decided to launch a third attack and received 400 fresh reinforcements from General Clinton back in Boston. This time, Howe formed his men up into columns to minimize the amount of men that could be killed by volleys, and then once again flung them at the colonial defenses. The third attack made it all the way to the defenses, and by this time the colonial forces had run out of ammunition. The British had their bayonets fixed, and close combat broke out along all the front lines. The Americans ordered a retreat, but the battles and fortifications really gave us some spectacular moments, including Colonel Prescott using a saber to parry British bayonets and being one of the last people to leave Breed's Hill. This last assault also saw the death of the American General Joseph Warren and Major Pitcairn on the British side, who led the British assault. With the Americans in retreat, the British had captured Charlestown and the rest of the peninsula. They had paid a heavy price, though. The British had suffered over 1,000 casualties. Many of these were officers. and in total about a tenth of all the casualties were from the officer class. This depleted a significant part of the entire British officer class, not just there in Boston, but on the entire American continent. The Americans suffered about 450 casualties. This over 2-to-1 ratio stunned the British and made them rethink their entire strategy of the war. Going forward, they would augment their own manpower with Hessian auxiliary mercenaries from Germany. The British also decided not to attack Dorchester Heights because of the massive casualties here and what could possibly happen if they assaulted another well-fortified place with high ground. The Pyrrhic victory at Bunker Hill was the final major action during the siege of Boston. About a month later, General George Washington arrived to take over the newly created Continental Army that had been formed out of the militias at Boston. Washington also received reinforcements and supplies, including riflemen. I will talk about the rifle and why it's important later on, but for now, just know that the rifle was the ace up the sleeve of the American forces. Remember Benedict Arnold? Well, he rode up to Washington's camp in late summer, informing him that the forts had been successfully seized and that there were tons of cannons there. Washington, Arnold, and a few other commanders held a meeting about them. During this time, it is said that a man by the name of Henry Knox threw out the idea of bringing them to Boston to help with the siege. Washington thought it was a great idea, and then proceeded to task Knox with accomplishing this logistical task. Knox rode off to Fort Ticonderoga. Washington then turned back and gave Benedict Arnold a new objective. He was to take 1,100 men and capture Quebec. Arnold accepted and left with his men to campaign in Canada. The rest of the summer, fall, and winter passed with a few raids here and there, but for the most part, another stalemate had settled in. Knox arrived at Fort Ticonderoga on December 5th, and over the next 2 months, he led a baggage train that contained 59 artillery pieces and mortars through the countryside in snow and ice to Washington's camp at Cambridge, Massachusetts. As soon as he received his artillery, Washington went and fortified Dorchester Heights. As you would remember, the British decided not to attack here last June. Big mistake. Washington put his cannons there and started bombarding the city. The British returned fire, but realized that there was no way their artillery would be able to reach Washington. Realizing the hopelessness of the situation, the British made the decision to abandon the city. They evacuated the city on March 17th, taking with them 11,000 people, including about 10,000 British soldiers. The Americans entered the city over the next few days. The siege of Boston was finished. The 4 British generals at Boston all had different outcomes. Thomas Gage would never again hold a command. General Howe would be sent to deploy the new army to capture New York. General Burgoyne was given the task of defending Canada from now Benedict Arnold's campaign, and General Clinton would remain as a general in America for the foreseeable future. The Americans were ecstatic. They had just driven off a British army, and all seemed to be going well for the new republic. Washington, though, was uneasy. Sure, they had just driven off the British, but he fully understood that the Empire would not let the war go so quickly. A few days after the siege of Boston ended, Washington told his army to pack up. They were moving to New York, where he predicted, correctly, that the British would try to strike next. There was also word of a British movement in the South. Back in January, General Clinton had left Boston with about 1,500 men. His destination was in the southern colonies, particularly the Carolinas. There, he was met with reinforcements, and a campaign began there. As previously mentioned, his people in the government thought this war would be over quickly. Others were warning of a much longer conflict. What everyone could agree on was that the siege of Boston had shocked the world. The American continent would never be the same. When the first two Continental Congresses met in 1774 and 1775, almost everyone was present there. All of the colonies had their representatives, and business went on as usual. There was, however, an empty spot. See, for both of these events, the organizers in the 13 colonies had invited the French Canadians of the former French-owned part of Canada called Quebec. It had only been a decade ago that they had changed hands from France to Britain, and there was a good chance they would rise up against their new overlords. At least, that's what they hoped. The 2 letters were sent for the Canadians to join the revolt, but no responses ever arrived. When war broke out in 1775, the Canadian province of Quebec seemed like a prime target for the colonists to seize more land and harm any British attempts at reinforcing their position on the continent. They also still believed that the people there would open their arms to the American forces and would revolt against the British, joining the brand new nation. The stage was set for an invasion. With the capture of Fort Ticonderoga, the seat of British power in the northern reaches of North America was tenuous. Fort Ticonderoga had been a linchpin in the defense of the region, and past that, the rest of the area was lightly defended. The British governor of Quebec, Guy Carleton, recognized this and began to prep for an invasion. He began fortifying St. John's, which was a town and fort that guarded the approaches to Montreal. St. John's had been raided earlier by Benedict Arnold when he had captured Fort Ticonderoga, and so it took time to rebuild the defenses there. The entire province of Quebec at this time was only garrisoned by about 600 soldiers, and both knew that if a large-scale invasion was able to occur, the conquest of the region could happen swiftly. Holding St. John's was the key to success. 120 men were dispatched to the region, and a small Canadian militia force of about 50 joined them there to garrison the town. At the same time, American General Philip Schuyler began to build up a force of over 1,000 men to attack the fort and Montreal. What would end up being a tipping point in this conflict is who could gain the support of the Native Americans in the area. Both sides appealed to the Haudenosaunee Confederacy for support. The British were able to attain mild support and were promised supplies and intelligence. Some native troops would even serve alongside the British Army during the campaign. The Americans were much less fortunate. They extracted promises of neutrality as long as after the war there would be an agreement of sorts to figure out settlement on the lands of the Native Americans. There would be a few natives that would also serve alongside the Americans, but this was negligible. The British definitely won here. It should be noted here that the tribes that made up the Haudenosaunee were split on the issue. Some wanted to stay neutral, and some wanted to help the Americans, and some wanted to help the British. The rifts that started here would wear away at the unity of the Confederacy until it would eventually break apart. In late August, American Brigadier General Richard Montgomery marched north with 1,200 men to attack Fort St. John's. Schuyler had, by this time, fallen ill, and had given over command of the campaign to Montgomery. He arrived and began sieging Fort St. John's on September 17th. The fort had been reinforced by many fresh men, and the garrison was now well into the hundreds. The American army settled in for a siege. After about a month, the Americans were able to capture a small fort called Fort Chambly. The capture of this fort provided winter provisions and ammunition that was almost immediately turned around to hold off and force back a British relief attempt led by Governor Carleton. When this failed, the defenders of the fort became disheartened and surrendered on November 3rd. The gates to Montreal lay open. The Americans marched towards the city and were able to capture it without a fight on the 13th. The campaign almost ended then and there. While fleeing, Carleton's fleet was sailing to Quebec City on the river and was approached by a boat with a truce flag. It asked for the surrender because the Americans had placed cannons up the river and would destroy the convoy if they didn't. Carleton snuck off his ship and made his way to Quebec on his own, and when the fleet realized that the cannon placements were in fact real and not a bluff, they all surrendered to the Americans. The American forces released many captured soldiers that would further go on to augment their strength. 2 Canadian regiments were also raised from the surrounding regions, and they would reinforce Montgomery's army. Montgomery then left General David Wooster in charge of Montreal with 200 men and sailed north towards Quebec City to finish his conquest. During the last episode, I mentioned how Benedict Arnold was also embarking on an invasion of Canada. You would also be correct in asking where he is right now. Well, I regret to inform you that I have no clue where he's coming out of the woods. Benedict Arnold marched north from Boston in late September with his forces. Instead of joining up with the army already at Fort Ticonderoga, he marched his men through present-day Maine's uncharted and undeveloped wilderness. The overland travel took a heavy toll on his men. They lost tons of food, gunpowder, and other supplies, and got lost many times. By the time they arrived on the Plains of Abraham right outside of Quebec City, Arnold had already lost 500 of his 1,100 men he set out with. Arnold and Montgomery met up and laid siege to the city. At this point, I want to stress how precarious Governor Carleton's position was and how monumental the next battle would be. Carleton was forced to give up most of the fortified Canadian land, and had lost most of his competent officers and soldiers. He was running out of food, had no clue if or when reinforcements were going to arrive, and in the last bastion of British control in Canada, he sat there, with a meager amount of food and a ragtag force that was made up of regular soldiers, officers, militia, and people that he can just grab off the side of the road and give them a gun. He also employed some Native Americans as scouts to gather intelligence on the American movements, but that was about it. On the other side, the American forces jointly commanded by Montgomery and Arnold knew that if they were to capture Quebec City, their mission was over. If this city fell, the colonies would have control over Quebec, and the British would be effectively driven off of the mainland of America, besides a few small holdouts. This would be a huge morale boost for them, and a massive hit to the enemy. They too were also racing against time. Arnold's men were battered and had run out of munitions. There was also an existential problem of enlistments running out. Many Americans were enlisted until January 1st the following year in 1776. The Americans would lose most of their forces if an attack was not launched soon. The planned attack was about to commence when suddenly a snowstorm hit on December 27th, and then an American soldier deserted and brought the current attack plans to the British guards in the city. This single act would have a major ripple effect on what was about to happen. Montgomery would have to go on to reformulate his plans, but this delayed the attack for several days until December 31st. On the night of the attack, a nor'easter blew in. A nor'easter, for those of you that don't know, is a powerful snowstorm akin to a hurricane or typhoon that hits the American East Coast during the wintertime on occasion. They are devastating, last a long time, and will blanket large swaths of land in tons of snow. Remember that I said that most soldiers' enlistments would be up at the end of the year? Well, this fact is what forced Montgomery to attack literally on the last day of the year in such awful weather. As previously mentioned, this whole battle was incredibly important for the outcome of the war in Canada, and was a complicated and precarious situation for both sides. On the eve of the attack, Montgomery split his forces into two. He would lead a force to capture some of the outside palisades and would then attack through the southern part of the lower city. Arnold would take his men and attack the northern part of the lower city. There would also be some feint attacks to the far north in order to draw British troops away from the two main prongs. Both groups would meet up and then attack the walled-in upper city. What both men didn't know is that by this time, they were outnumbered and would be attacking heavily entrenched forces that were fighting for their lives. At 5 a.m. on December 31st, flares went up from the American positions and both sides attacked. Disaster occurred almost immediately. Montgomery found heavier British resistance than he believed. Undeterred, he instead unsheathed his sword and led a charge with his men towards the enemy position. What he did not know is that this position was actually a heavily fortified blockhouse that not only contained soldiers, but cannons. As he charged, a volley of musket and cannon fire rang out. Montgomery was killed immediately as he took a shot directly to the head. Many men were killed, including 2 senior officers that charged with him. There were 2 important men who survived this charge. Colonel Donald Campbell, who took command after the other officers were killed, and a man named Aaron Burr, who might, just maybe, have an impact on the course of American history later down the line. Campbell ordered his men to retreat and to no longer perform any more attacks. This part of the battle was finished, and this was a resounding defeat for the Continental Army. Arnold had similar problems. His forces entered the city and began fighting ferociously. Arnold was wounded in the leg from a musket ball and was forced to leave the battle. Command of his forces then fell onto Daniel Morgan. Morgan led an attack that ventured deep into the lower city. He captured a British position and pressed onwards, though the farther he went, the worse it became. Eventually, Carleton realized that the attacks on the northern gates were feints, and redirected Captain George Laws to attack Morgan. Laws took his 500 men and surrounded him. Fierce fighting broke out, and the Americans were prevented from breaking out until eventually their ammunition ran out. By now, many of the soldiers felt defeated and knew they had lost. They surrendered en masse to the British soldiers, and their fight was over. To close out, the British forces attacked small fortified American positions outside the city, and then retreated back once it was done. Arnold, over the next few days, gathered his men outside the city and refused to retreat. He wrote to Wooster back in Montreal about marching north to reinforce him. Wooster wrote back that he could not, since his situation required all his troops to keep the peace in the city. We'll get back to this predicament in just a little bit. Arnold stubbornly laid siege to the city and requested reinforcements from Congress. By now, with over 400 men captured and many more returning home since their enlistments were finished, Arnold was left with about 600 men. He was outnumbered 3-1. His siege didn't really impact the city at all, and what reinforcements he did receive served only to plug his dwindling numbers. See, an outbreak of smallpox in his camp tore through his troops. Throughout the winter, not much would change. Arnold would be freezing in a smallpox-ridden camp, while Carleton would continue to fortify Quebec City in case of another attack. By April, command of these forces near Quebec City were transferred to Wooster and then over to General John Thomas, a veteran from the Siege of Boston. He arrived and saw the effort was going nowhere, and began to retreat towards Montreal. There wasn't much to retreat to. Over the last few months, Wooster had done exactly what he shouldn't have. He levied taxes on the locals without giving them representation in Congress. He procured goods and, importantly, was anti-Catholic. Remember how the people here were descendants of French settlers, and the French were very Catholic? Yep, not a good look. Even a commission that had Benjamin Franklin in it arrived and could not halt the huge swing in public opinion. When news arrived of the impending American retreat, hope of controlling the city became hopeless. All this time, Carleton stayed inside his walls, and the past commanders who had left the city were decisively defeated, and he didn't want this to be his fate. He waited until his reinforcements arrived. With an additional 200 fresh troops at his disposal, Carleton advanced, and what was at first an orderly retreat turned into a full-on rout. His Continental forces moved out of Montreal, and eventually all of them crossed back over into New York to occupy the Lake Champlain forts and Fort Ticonderoga. General Thomas died during this retreat from smallpox, which had broken out and was rampaging through all the American forces. Realizing that the British now had the manpower to attack into New York since they had now been reinforced by 9,000 soldiers, Arnold decided to do a series of delaying actions with the hope of holding out until winter hit. He commanded and lost a devastating naval battle at Valcour Island, where pretty much the entire Continental fleet was wiped out, and then did a tactical retreat, destroying the fortifications at Crown Point. When the British arrived there, they found nothing. He arrived at Fort Ticonderoga successful, though. He had prevented a full-scale British attack into New York. By early October, when this all occurred, The snow had begun, and the campaigning season was over. The Quebec Campaign was done, and it was a resounding defeat. While the idea of invading Quebec would persist throughout the war, American forces would never again enter the province, at least for the entirety of this war. The Quebec Campaign was also the first defeat suffered by the Continental Army, and was a wake-up call after their recent wins in Lexington and Concord, and at the Siege of Boston. Arnold had suffered some defeats, and also had won some major victories. His story is not over. For now, he stays at Fort Ticonderoga with his men for the winter. On the British side, Guy Carleton was criticized for losing so much territory and then being passive when he had the chance to seriously crush the American forces. He also received praise, though, for grabbing victory from the jaws of defeat. His story will also continue, though it should be noted that, along with the 9,000 reinforcements that arrived, also came John Burgoyne. Remember him from the Siege of Boston? It would be his job, and not Carleton's, to recapture the Hudson Valley, once campaign season arrived in 1777. Among these 9,000 troops were a large detachment of German troops. These Hessians, as they would later be called, were used to augment the British forces with non-English soldiers, so it wouldn't be as big of a drain on manpower that was needed elsewhere. They will be important later in the war. As 1776 comes to a close in the northern theater of this war, the stage has been set for a titanic clash between men with ambition. The outcomes of these such battles will not only change the course of the war, but also the course of world history. After the capture of Boston, General George Washington left no time to waste. He guessed correctly that the British would now try to capture New York City. He immediately marched his troops there and began fortifying the city and the surrounding region. So, why New York? Boston was a major port along the Atlantic coast, but it wasn't the largest. By the mid-1770s, New York was the center for American culture and commerce. New York was a vital link between the New England and Southern colonies. Lines of communication, supply, and troops all passed through New York. Whoever controlled this city and the Hudson River and Hudson River Valley effectively controlled the northern part of the new nation. Right now, this was the American rebels. Washington and the British general Sir William Howe knew this, and that New York was the linchpin. Whoever controlled New York City controlled northern commerce and logistics, and whoever controlled the Hudson Valley controlled troop transport. In January of 1776, General Washington dispatched General Charles Lee to the city to begin building its defenses. Lee built a series of forts surrounding the city, the most important of which was named Fort Washington, and was placed at the northern end of Manhattan Island. The other two forts, Fort Constitution, later renamed to Fort Lee, was meant to guard the Hudson River from the New Jersey side, and then Fort Independence was built in Westchester to both guard the area and support Fort Washington. These forts were meant to secure the approaches to the city from the Hudson River and the bay. Essentially, they were meant to nullify any British advantage in naval power and force their troops onto land. There, the defenses of the surrounding areas would pin them down and stop any advance. This is similar to the Bunker Hill defense, just on a larger scale. During the next few months, Washington began hearing words of British ships and soldiers massing north in Nova Scotia, and had their sights on New York City. Washington called for reinforcements, primarily from Massachusetts, and while he got a few, for the most part, he was left out to dry. I should pause for a moment and state something that should be fairly obvious at this point. American intelligence was very bad. During the initial weeks of the war, the intelligence wasn't really that bad. The Americans were able to notify their forces of the British movements towards Lexington and Concord, and they were able to figure out that the British would attack Bunker Hill. These were important victories, but they all happened at the last minute. Both moves of the British Army were only able to have been correctly identified as British actions as soon as they were about to happen, such as at Bunker Hill, or as they were already marching towards Lexington and Concord. During the Quebec Campaign, major errors led to thousands of soldiers' deaths. American intelligence incorrectly predicted that they would receive major support from the French Canadians. This support did not materialize in major numbers. They also incorrectly thought that a small American force could overwhelm a small British garrison. This, of course, did not happen. American chances of victory died along with their soldiers in the blistering snowstorm in Quebec City last Christmas. It was here in New York that American intelligence would have their largest blunder. Washington knew that the British had a massive force to attack New York City. He thought he knew that it was about 130 ships in number, but he did not know where in New York they would attack or with how many soldiers they would attack with. He most importantly, though, had no idea when the British would attack. He just knew that they would arrive at some point. He had to guess at which places to guard and fortify, and so he chose to fortify the harbor and rivers due to the British Navy. This is only a bad decision in hindsight. At the time, I feel like Washington made the right choice with the knowledge he had. He also knew that he had bad intel. He wrote to Congress during the time the following quote, "Nor have we any further intelligence on their designs. There is one final point I need to make. The British knew of the American fortifications, where their defenses were, and which roads were and were not guarded." In summary, American intelligence was abysmal during the New York campaign and left Washington high and dry. The consequences of this would be absolutely catastrophic. When the British arrived, they did so in force. American soldiers recounted looking out over the horizon in the morning and seeing the massive British armada imposed over the harbor of New York City. Soon after that, British troops began landing on Staten Island. This would be their base to attack the city. The force was led by Admiral Richard Howe and General William Howe. Now, it is important to mention that the Howe brothers both saw this conflict as something that could be resolved peacefully. They saw the American colonists as fellow countrymen. They gave out a pamphlet that stated that any colonist who betrayed the enemy force would receive money and land when the war was over. This did not work. They then met with some members of the Continental Congress, including Ben Franklin, to try and find a peace settlement. This did not work. A major factor in defeating any peace attempts was the Declaration of Independence, which had just been signed and sent out. As the British were landing troops and preparing for an attack, people in New York read out the document to the American soldiers. The war had just reached the point of no return. With signatures on that piece of paper, peace would only occur once the armies of either side were defeated. The American soldiers had something to fight for before, but now it was concrete. This war was for their liberty, their wealth, and for the futures of their families. Given this context, I do not think it's that crazy that peace is not achieved here. However, I want you all to remember how the Howe brothers saw that the battle was between compatriots rather than a revolution. This different lens would have implications later on in this campaign. With the collapse of peace talks, the time for battle had begun. On the morning of August 22nd, 4,000 British regulars landed unopposed on Long Island. In the weeks prior, the Americans had fortified the island heavily. There were troops here on the beaches, but they merely retreated and burned some supplies. By the noon of that day, 15,000 British soldiers and 40 artillery pieces had arrived. All of this was unopposed. Washington was told by his intelligence that about only 9,000 had landed there. He felt like it was a feint and only sent 1,500 reinforcements to the American positions. The following day, 5,000 Hessian troops arrived to reinforce the British. There were now 6,000 American soldiers facing 20,000 British soldiers. The Americans held strong positions on Brooklyn Heights, overlooking this area, and prepared for the incoming British attack. Remember when I said American intelligence was abysmal? This is their first and absolutely horrific mistake. The night before the attack was to commence, a loyalist told the British about a route behind American lines that was only sparsely defended. It was called Jamaica Pass, and if the British attacked there, they could outflank the American defenses. The morning of the attack, a force of 10,000 British soldiers attacked the Americans straight on. The fighting was rough and casualties were sustained on both sides. Importantly, the American defenses were formidable and held against the waves of British attacks. As this went on, though, General Charles Cornwallis led his men through Jamaica Pass and surprised the Americans. There were only 5 militiamen patrolling the area when Cornwallis arrived, and they were easily overwhelmed, and the American forces on Long Island were quickly surrounded. This is the first moment that the Howe brothers' timidness had an impact. They ordered the British troops not to force an assault on the American positions. Instead, they would eventually attack and fight the rear guard. The Americans were able to evacuate most of their forces back towards New York City. Later on, when they were asked why they did not attack, William Howe said that it was because of the fear of heavy casualties like at Bunker Hill. Some people bought the argument, some people didn't. I actually do believe Howe here, although I definitely think some of his personal beliefs got in the way, but I don't think that was the whole reason for him not attacking. Realizing what had just occurred, Washington began moving troops to fortify Brooklyn Heights and staffing the forts that dotted the city's upper reaches. It was now that the sheer amount of British troops became apparent. Washington was under the impression that he was facing about the same amount of British troops that he commanded in his army. It was only now that he realized that the British forces were more than his. Washington took the before-mentioned route, evacuating his forces north to fortify the forts and sent another contingent to garrison the city. His biggest fear was that he would be outflanked via the sea, which was actually very warranted. In September, Howe landed troops in Manhattan as a way of outflanking Washington and trapping him in New York City. In turn, Washington quickly withdrew his army to the north to Harlem Heights and to all of his fortifications. There was a very good chance that had Howe pinned Washington in New York City, the war would have ended then and there. Howe pursued Washington to Harlem Heights. He caught up to him on September 16th and prepared for an attack. On the morning of the 16th, Washington sent up a small group of soldiers to reconnoiter the British lines. The party encountered some British pickets and they skirmished. Though the loss was small, the commander of the small recon force, Thomas Knowlton, realized he was getting outflanked and ordered a retreat. Howe then ordered his army to follow them, believing that the larger American force was also retreating. Instead, he found Washington's army very well intact and very much not running. The forces engaged and the fighting stagnated until a small American cavalry force flanked the British and forced them to retreat. While only a small skirmish, the Battle of Harlem Heights became the first time the American forces had beaten back the British during this campaign. Washington waited there on the high ground for a bit. He knew that these were important places to potentially hold, but at the same time his army had suffered major casualties over the course of the campaign. He had some of his troops retreat north into the hills and asked Israel Putnam to scout ahead to figure out where the British army had camped. Shortly, Putnam returned, informing Washington that not only were the British nearby, but their camps also threatened the army's retreat and supply lines. Putnam pointed out that the towns of White Plains seemed to be the pathway forward. Washington rushed men into the town and prepared a hasty defense on a hill overlooking the area. The British army encountered him, and Howe sent a force of British regulars and Hessian mercenaries up the hill to take it. The fighting was brief and brutal.
the American militia collapsed under the intense attack and discipline by the British soldiers. Seeing the right side of his army fade away, Washington ordered a retreat and had the Delaware regiment swing over from his left to provide covering fire till they could all be brought out in good order. Over the next 2 days, Washington and Howe fortified the surrounding hills. Howe decided that he would attack Washington the next day to finish off his army, but that proved to be too late. Washington had already pulled his men back towards Fort Washington and across the Hudson River. When everything was settled, on November the 16th, Washington ordered the evacuation of Fort Washington. This was the final Patriot fort on the New York side of the Hudson River. The reason for ordering this retreat was because of British forces outflanking every single position and nearly surrounding the fort. The fort was thought to be impossible to take, given its advantageous position overlooking the entire battlefield. It was well provisioned, filled with cannons, and had 3,000 men. Washington was convinced by his confidant Nathaniel Greene and the garrison commander Robert McGaw to let them hold out. This so impregnable fortress lasted only about a half a day. After it was surrounded on all sides by Hessian soldiers and the Royal Navy, in just 12 hours the British forced the surrender of 3,000 of Washington's soldiers. The Americans were absolutely stunned, and when the British forces swung north quickly and landed near Fort Lee on the 20th, they ordered a hasty retreat without firing a shot. Every single fort that had been constructed by General Lee early on in the campaign were now held in British hands without hardly a single casualty. It was getting cold in the United States. Fearing that his army would be caught out in the open during the winter and that the British would be pushing towards the American capital of Philadelphia, Washington marched his men all the way through New Jersey and into Pennsylvania, all the while being pursued by the British Army and Hessian mercenaries. Morale was extremely low during this time. Cold weather, lack of food, the impending attack on the capital, and the fact that the Americans were thoroughly kicked out of New York City all played a part in this. The Patriots stopped their retreat just across the Delaware River. Here is where Washington would regroup and prepare for the spring. On the opposite side, British General Charles Cornwallis ordered his forces to stop the pursuit and prepare for winter. His men established a series of forts from New Brunswick to Burlington. This winter would be used to resupply by both armies and a time to draw up new plans. The New York campaign had been an utter disaster for the Americans. After the decisive victory in Boston a year prior, this felt like a punch in the gut. Many in the government even asked if Washington was the right man to lead their army. Washington's own men even questioned him. Things weren't all amazing for the British, though. Remember how General Howe took a more lax approach to these battles because of his view that the Americans could be brought back into the fold? Those decisions would haunt him for the rest of the war and the rest of his career. Howe had multiple different occasions where he could have ended the entire conflict by capturing Washington and the large Patriot army. So, while Washington was beaten, he was still alive. Howe's incompetence had turned what could have been an overall strategic victory into just a tactical one, but albeit a very good tactical victory. Washington would live on to fight another day. Fight on he would, because while the British were resting and celebrating their victory, George Washington was scheming.
While the New York campaign was unfolding on land, an equally important yet entirely unknown development occurred at sea. During the movement of his troops near the end of the New York campaign, George Washington instructed Ezra Lee to test out a secret invention. Between 1771 and 1775, General Washington helped finance the American inventor David Bushnell to create a vessel to break a possible British blockade. The fruit of this labor was an underwater submersible called the Turtle. In other words, the fruit of his finances and Bushnell's labor was the first ever submarine. Since the British were blockading New York Harbor and the Americans did not have the naval strength to break it,
Washington felt like this would be the best time to try out this new high-tech weapon of war to see if there was a way to combat the British ships that were currently stationed off the coast of New York. Washington tasked Sergeant Ezra Lee to pilot the submersible and attack the British flagship, HMS Eagle. In short, the attack did not go well. The submarine only had about 20 minutes of air, and Lee found it very hard to paddle out underwater against the bay currents while also having minimal air to breathe. He did reach the HMS Eagle, but failed to plant the bomb, and the bomb actually floated off and blew up somewhere else down the river, and Lee returned to American lines. About a month later, he tried again to plant a bomb on a ship, but this also failed because he was spotted and nearly ran out of air. Again, as it turns out, a small capsule with only minimal air that is self-propelled is not exactly the greatest ship. The Turtle would not make a third voyage, though. It was scuttled about a month later when the British took control of New York City. While the missions that the Turtle was deployed on were failures, it cannot be overstated how important this event was to naval, and by extension, world history. Bushnell's invention, while not very practical, set the events into motion that would eventually culminate with the submarines of the American Civil War, the famed German U-boats of the first two world wars, and eventually the nuclear-powered submarines that are used in the world's navies today. The retreat across New Jersey was miserable. Not only was it cold, but many of George Washington's men also did not have shoes and other necessities to survive. Washington's mighty army of 20,000 was now down to about 3,000 men directly under his control and a few thousand in separate commands around the region. The retreat stopped at a small town just across the Delaware River in eastern Pennsylvania called Bristol. Washington immediately set to work summoning reinforcements to prepare for a British attack. It was now early December. It was here in Bristol that Washington also received more bad news. Congress had fled from Philadelphia towards Baltimore and Maryland to be safe from British advances. Deserters had drained his army, and at the end of the year, many more men would leave because their enlistments were up, the exact thing that happened last year to Benedict Arnold in Canada. In 30 days, there would not be an army to fight the war. There may not even be a country to fight for anymore. A few days later, word reached Washington that General Lee had been captured while acting really dumb, and that what remained of his forces would shortly arrive. Washington hoped for 4,000 men. He instead received 2,000. A lesser man would have quit under these circumstances, but that's not what George Washington did. Something needed to be done to rectify this situation and restore faith in this war. He sent out calls for reinforcements, and later in mid-December, 1,000 militia from Pennsylvania arrived at his camp. He also received more veterans from the Quebec Campaign. On paper, Washington had 7,500 men. In reality, he had 6,000 that could fight. The rest were sick, but he could work with 6,000. This small army was a far cry from his 20,000 strong force at the beginning of the year, but 6,000, that could still win a battle. Washington knew of a Hessian mercenary force that was occupying Trenton a few miles away. That would be his target. They were resting and preparing for Christmas time, the perfect time to attack. On December 24th, Washington gathered a war party at his headquarters. He asked them to help him draw together plans to not only cross the Delaware River, but to also attack the town of Trenton, New Jersey. The American army would cross at 3 points with hopes to cut off the Hessian forces from a retreat. The groups set out on the evening of December 25th, or Christmas Day. That evening, a nor'easter blew in right as the crossings began, and from here on out, there would be no communication between Washington and the other two parts of this mini invasion. The other two groups were not able to continue on with the attack because of the storm, but Washington and his men pushed on. I want to take a small moment to talk about the Hessians and what they were doing at this time. Their commander, Johann Rall, definitely knew that something was going to happen, and he had received intelligence reports from loyalists and deserters that the Americans were planning something, but to his belief. But there was belief amongst the British and Hessian forces that the Americans were not good fighters. I mean, seriously, they just kicked them out of New York really, really easily. So he wasn't really that intimidated. The battle that occurred was very quick, and there was brutal hand-to-hand fighting all throughout the streets. In the end, after a group of Hessian soldiers were cornered in the orchard and made to surrender, the battle was over. A small group was able to escape across the bridge that there should have been guards for, but remember, that part of Washington's attack force didn't make it across. But about 900 Hessians were captured. In terms of casualties, it was very lopsided. The Americans only received a few wounded, and the only 2 that died had died from exposure on the march there. The Hessians had lost 22, including Johann Rall. This was a stunning victory for Washington and his men. Washington met back up with the rest of his forces and pushed north towards Brunswick. He then fought a series of battles against General Cornwallis at Sunpink Creek and Princeton. After winning these, he turned around and marched to Morristown to winter instead of pushing on deeper into New Jersey and back towards New York. In the span of just 10 days, Washington had stunned the British Army and reinvigorated the American war effort, showing that it was possible to beat the British on the field of battle. Over the course of the winter, Washington would continue to build his strength to prepare for the spring campaigns of 1777. The American forces split after their defeat in New York. Washington took about half the men and marched back towards New Jersey. To the northwest, though, sat Charles Lee and his contingent of American troops. He left Washington's side because of his harsh criticism how the New York campaign was just fought. He even went out of his way on multiple occasions to write letters behind Washington's back to influential military and political leaders in the Revolution, calling Washington inept and not fit enough to lead an army. This criticism, though, does not just come from him being angry over the devastating loss of New York. See, Lee had been competing for the job to command the entire Continental Army, the job that Washington now held. Lee smelled blood in the water, and he was going for it. By withholding troops, Lee hoped to create a scenario where the British continuously push Washington back towards the American capital of Philadelphia, where the politicians would lose faith in him and give the command of the army to Lee. This plan was going great until the evening of December 12th, 1776. Lee and his officers decided that night to go into a small town called Basking Ridge in New Jersey. They arrived and started partying at a local tavern. See, Lee didn't really tell anyone where they were going and only intended to be there for the evening and then to head back. They just wanted a good time. He was near British troops, but thought there's no way they were going to find him, right? Right? Yeah, the British found him there. He was arrested and taken into custody by the British cavalry, and later on his forces would join Washington, as mentioned in the Trenton Campaign video, which you should watch. The card is linked at the top of the video. But Lee would stay in captivity until, spoiler alert, there was a big prisoner exchange between the Continental Army and the British Army in 1778, and Lee was able to rejoin Continental forces and began to command troops in the army again. Although, all that will be covered in a future episode in this series. But just going forward, in the back of your mind, always remember, Washington's position as the leader of the Continental Army was not always as safe as it is now appeared in American media today. There was a time where there were many people competing for that top job, and Washington had a couple things not gone in his favor, very well could have been ousted from his position. I hope you all enjoyed this video. If you did, hit the like button and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Have a great day.